kind of get the indication a little bit that we were tired of being pushed around by the British, and we decided that we were going to give them the business again. Well, it's kind of interesting because when we declared a war on Great Britain had an interesting strategy concerning this war. They were not interested in securing the American colonies back. Okay, that isn't what they want. A lot of people think the War of 1812 was fought so Britain could get the colonies back. They weren't interested in getting the colonies back. They simply wanted to teach the United States of America a lesson and ensure that the United States never again would declare war on their country. Okay, and so Britain's philosophy is a victory over these Americans in the War of 1812 will leave the United States at the mercy of Great Britain forever. So again, the philosophy of Great Britain here wasn't to win the war and gain possessions of property. Great Britain was simply going to teach the United States of America a lesson. We are going to whip your tail, and then you're going to be at our mercy forever. Never again will you have enough guts to declare war on the Great Britain. Okay, so that was kind of their idea. So I want to just make it clear early that England was not interested in securing any of the colonies back. They simply wanted to teach America a lesson and make sure that America never declared war on them again and forever past the victory of the Americans in the War of 1812, the United States would be at their mercy. Well, that's going to take us to our first subtopic, which is an unprepared American military. Okay, we decide to declare war, but we do not have a very prepared American military. Why?
Because we cut funding.
Right. Thomas Jefferson asked Congress to cut funding to both the Navy and the Army and reduce them in size, which they did. So we go into this war very, very unprepared. And I'm going to give you 4 examples of how unprepared the United States was going into the War of 1812. The United States Navy, number one, the United States Navy had been cut down to 20 ships total. There were only 20 ships available in the United States Navy compared to the more than 1,000 ships in the Royal Navy. So, the United States Navy had a total of 20 ships total compared to the more than 1,000 ships the British had in their Navy. Very outnumbered on the seas. 20 ships to 1,000 ships. The United States Army had less than 7,000 troops total available for this war, where the British had tens of thousands of troops available. So the United States, number 2, only had 7,000 soldiers ready for battle, whereas the British had tens of thousands of troops available. So we're outnumbered on the seas and we're outnumbered on land, so to speak. The third example of a very unprepared American military is most of the commanders of these 7,000 troops and 20 ships were elderly commanders from what? The Revolutionary War, yeah. Yeah, the Revolutionary War. So many of the commanders that were going to command these troops were elderly Revolutionary War veterans. They were not very efficient. They were old, too old to fight, too old to lead. Okay, so they were elderly Revolutionary War veterans. And the fourth problem that we had such a difficulty is President Madison did not appoint an overall commander for the war effort. You ever heard the expression, too many chiefs and not enough braves? Okay? We did not appoint an overall commander that would plan strategy. We were too fragmented. Not only were these leaders poor leaders because they were elderly Revolutionary War veterans, but he did not pick or did not appoint an overall commander to direct the war effort, which left American troops both poorly trained and equipped. So that's a big problem as we get into this thing, and it's going to result in our next subtopic, which is early disasters at the nation's capital. Early disasters at the nation's capital. Early disasters at the nation's capital. Well, in August of 1814, just 6 miles from Washington, D.C., the British Army was marching toward an unguarded capital with approximately 30,000 soldiers. So in August of 1814, just 6 miles from Washington, D.C., the British Army was marching toward an unguarded capital with approximately 30,000 soldiers. So picture that in your mind. You have an unguarded capital in Washington, D.C. 6 miles outside of the city limits are 30,000 British soldiers marching towards the capital. At that 6-mile barrier, the British engage the American military and militia forces, and the Americans, who are very unprepared, are soon overrun. So the Americans make an effort to stop this march 6 miles out of Washington, D.C., but the American military and the American militia forces that join are soon overrun. They're soon overrun. They do not stop the British advance. And when word gets out that the British advance has not been stopped, what do residents of Washington begin to do?
Flee.
Very good. Evacuate the city. They start evacuating because they have no line of defense. The British are coming to the nation's capital. So when residents of Washington find out that this effort on the part of the American military and militia fails in stopping these marching British troops, they begin to evacuate the city. And the British soldiers pour into Washington, D.C., and they destroy several public buildings. Okay, they destroy several public buildings. So the British continue their march. They pour into Washington, D.C., 30,000 strong, and destroy several public buildings. Now, they've developed kind of a new weapon, the British have, and it's known as a Congreve rocket. A Congreve rocket. And basically what this was a modern day what? Pipe bomb. Modern day pipe bomb on a stick of bamboo. That's basically what it was. This rocket was made out of iron tubes. It had a cone for a nose, and these Congreve rockets weighed anywhere from 3 pounds to 32 pounds, depending on the construction. So this was basically a pipe bomb on a stick of bamboo. It was made from iron tubes, had a cone nose, and weighed anywhere, depending on the construction, from 3 pounds to 32 pounds. Yeah, and the range of the rockets was a wide range too, because the smaller ones would go about 1,000 yards. The bigger ones would travel as much as 2 miles. And they would explode on contact. That was the idea behind this. They would explode on contact. So the range of these rockets was from 1,000 yards to 2 miles, and they would explode upon contact. Now, they weren't very accurate. So you might shoot, it might go 2 miles, but it might not hit your target. So it wasn't meant to hit and destroy, like a bomb. What was it meant to do? What would be the reason they would shoot a Congreve rocket? To start a fire, or basically raise havoc. Okay? Nobody had seen these things before, right? They're brand new. Okay? And so the purpose of the Congreve rocket on the part of the British would be to use them to start fires and raise havoc, and I'll show you some examples of that on video later. The man that invented the Congreve rocket was a British inventor by the name of Sir William Congreve. Sir William Congreve was the inventor of the Congreve rocket, and we'll talk more about those as we go. So the rocket was the brainchild of a British inventor by the name of Sir William Congreve. Now, using these weapons and their ground troops, I'm going to give you 4 examples of how the British raised havoc on the nation's capital, and 4 specific buildings that they attacked. This is during the War of 1812. First of all, the Capitol building, it was unfinished. They were still building it. It wasn't as you see it today. But anyway, they set the unfinished Capitol building on fire. They set the unfinished Capitol building on fire. Now, those of you that choose to make the trip to DC, when we have a tour of the Capitol, they will show you burn marks on the walls of the Capitol that are still there from this attack I'm talking about in 1814. They're still there. Okay, you can still see them. Okay, it's pretty cool once you know about it to know what they mean. Second thing they did is they set the Treasury building on fire. They set the Treasury building on fire. So they are raising havoc. They set the unfinished Capitol building on fire. They set the Treasury building on fire. They also burnt down the Library of Congress, and what did they use to fuel the fire? The 3,000 books that were in the Library of Congress. They lit them on fire and burned it up. I don't know if you know the history behind that, but when they burnt the Library of Congress down, using the books to fuel the fire, where did we get the books that are in there now? Anybody know where did we initially get those books? Anybody know that? After they burned them all up in this fire? They bought Thomas Jefferson's private library to start to restore the Library of Congress. Okay? And they also assaulted the White House. Believe it or not, they even had the guts to assault the White House. Now that's an interesting story I'm going to tell you about a little bit. Who's the president? What was the first lady's name? Anybody know? Dolly Madison was the first lady. Now British soldiers invaded the White House, and then when they got there, there had been a meal prepared for 40 people. Mrs. Madison was expecting 40 guests to come for dinner, and so when these British soldiers invaded the White House, they actually sat down and enjoyed that meal for 40 people before they raised their havoc. Okay? It was originally set up by First Lady Dolly Madison for guests. When they get there, she has taken off. She's evacuated with the president. And that table was set ready to go for 40 people, and the British soldiers sat right down and enjoyed that meal. Now, just a little bit of a note. The First Lady had earlier evacuated, and the only thing she really took with her was a very important painting of George Washington. She did not want that to fall in the hands of the British. So she took a painting with her. You'll hear a little bit more about that later. Now, why is it important that she got out of there and she didn't get captured by the British? What do you think the British would have done to the First Lady if they would have captured her? Anybody want to guess? Well, that's close. What do you think they'd have done with her? Historians believe they would have taken her back to London and put her in a cage and put her on display for all the people to come and look at. Embarrass her. That's what they thought they would do. Not kill her, not hold her for ransom, which was a good guess, but actually take her back to London, put her in a cage, put her on display for all the citizens of London. Would that be embarrassing for the United States of America? Sure would. So it's probably lucky the First Lady had gotten out of there with the painting, because historians believe that if she was captured, they would have probably put her in a cage and put her on display back in London. Well, after they fed themselves on Mrs. Madison's meal, the soldiers ransacked the White House and then set it on fire. And by the time they were done, only the shell of the mansion was visible. Only the shell of the mansion was visible. Now, there still are remnants of that in the White House. We don't, if you get a White House tour, they don't take you in that much detail to get to see that, but there are still parts of the White House that they have, kept that'll show you the assault by the British on the White House during the War of 1812. So we weren't doing very well early. They had set our Capitol on fire, our Treasury building, our Library of Congress, and the White House. Okay, that'll take us to, I think, one of the most important things we're going to talk about in history this year, and that's the British assault on Baltimore and Fort McHenry. Okay, the British assault on Baltimore and Fort McHenry. Now, the reason we even talk about an assault on Baltimore and Fort McHenry is because the British had a plan in the War of 1812. They were going to take Washington, which they already kind of have, right? Then they were going to go to Baltimore, and then they were going to go to Philadelphia, and then they were going to go to New York City with the idea of putting the American government in total chaos. And so they had already accomplished part of their goal. They had already been to Washington, D.C. The next plan was Baltimore, then Philadelphia, then New York City. So the reason we're talking about the British assault on Baltimore and Fort McHenry is the fact that Baltimore is the next target in line, okay? Now, in the Baltimore harbor, protecting the city was a fort called Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry, okay? So for the British to be successful in their capture of Baltimore, they're going to need to be able to overcome Fort McHenry. Okay, it's in Baltimore Harbor, set up specifically to protect the city from this attack. Fort McHenry. Now the man in charge of Fort McHenry is George Armistead. George Armistead is the man in charge of Fort McHenry. He's the commander at Fort McHenry. What's that?
Is he related to the other Armistead?
No, no. Now, he's got a plan for the British. He knows they're coming. He's got a plan for them. Got a little plan for them. Knowing they're coming, he orders a brand new American flag to fly over the garrison in Baltimore Harbor. So he knows they're on their way. He knows eventually they're going to come to Baltimore. He doesn't know the exact order, but he knows eventually they're coming there. And so he orders a brand new American flag to fly over the garrison of Fort McHenry. And he orders a big one. It's 42 feet by 30 feet. 42 feet by 30 feet. He wants the largest possible flag to fly over the garrison as an act of defiance. He wants the British to see that great big American flag and what it stands for as they begin their assault on Baltimore. So Armistead's plan is to have the flag sewn as large as possible over Fort McHenry. It ends up being 42 feet by 30 feet. He knew the British would be attacking the fort sooner or later, and the large flag was intended to be kind of an act of defiance by Armistead and the Americans against the British. Well, on September 12th of 1814, September 12th of 1814, British ships of war approach the port of Baltimore with Fort McHenry as their target. Okay? On that date that I mentioned, British warships sail into the port of Baltimore with Fort McHenry in their sights. It's their intention to take the city, and to take the city you've got to take the fort. And that again is September 12th of 1814. Now, kind of think about this. Great Britain had 8 bombing vessels in their arsenal, total, 8. They sent 5 of their 8 to the Baltimore port. 5 of the 8. They were being in business, okay? So Great Britain had sent 5 of their total 8 bombing vessels that they had in their arsenal to Baltimore, showing the seriousness to take that city. Now, here's kind of a story here we're going to start with. On one of those 5 bombing ships was an American lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key. On one of those British bombing ships was an American lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key. Now you might be wondering, what in the world is an American lawyer doing on a British vessel that's setting up to attack Fort McHenry and the city of Baltimore? Well, he was kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, but will turn out to be the right place at the right time. He is traveling with the British because he's trying to negotiate the release of one of his American clients, a guy by the name of Dr. William Beans. He was being held on a ship in the fleet. Okay, he had been accused of a crime violating British law, and they held him on one of the ships. Well, Francis Scott Key got access to this British ship because he was trying to negotiate the release of his client to prove that he was not guilty. Well, during their travels to Baltimore Harbor, Francis Scott Key finds enough evidence, and he convinces the British commander, Robert Ross, to release his client. Okay, so he's negotiating the release and trying to come up with evidence to prove that his client is not guilty as they are moving towards Baltimore Harbor. And finally, Francis Scott Key gathers enough evidence to show that his client, Dr. William Beans, was not guilty of what he was accused of, and Commander Robert Ross agrees to release him. However, he's not going to release him until when? After the battle. Once we kick the Americans' rear ends here and take Baltimore, then I'll let you go. But I'm not going to risk letting you go now when we're about in the middle of a battle. So Commander Ross agrees to release William Beans and let Beans and Francis Scott Key off the ship, but he's going to hold them until Baltimore is secured. Once the city is taken by the British, both men will be released. Well, the whole British strategy at Baltimore is going to be from sea. They're basically going to commence a major naval assault in Baltimore Harbor to capture Fort McHenry. They're going to fire cannonball after cannonball after cannonball from those 5 British bombing vessels into Fort McHenry. Now, the range of these British cannons are 2 miles. They can shoot a cannonball up to 2 miles. So their whole strategy here isn't going to put troops on the ground.